Well, everybody get comfortable. I'll try to go through this fairly quick, but I've been known to talk too much, and I won't. I'll try not to keep you up all night. But this is obviously fly fishing in Alaska, and I'll be covering the 3 seasons: spring, summer, fall, and on any budget because I've fished Alaska literally with no money and with a little bit of money. In fact, sometimes when I was in the Forest Service on the Kenai Peninsula back in the 70s, I'd buy a keg of beer for $70 and just take it to the airport and hang out. And people would ask me, "What are you doing with all that beer?" I'd just say, "Well, I just want to go fishing." And then I'd go on someone's plane to all these great places for $70. So I got a little bit of history. Here's a little bit of that. So 1975, I was kind of a mountain man living off grayling and sockeye salmon. And over to 1980s, when I was up there guiding in the late 70s, early 80s, lots of amazing adventures and some interesting airplane situations. Lower middle is Ted Williams, the famous baseball player. He came to the lodge I worked at, and so did Bob Hope and lots of other movie stars and sports celebrities. But I've just had a great run in Alaska. So, most of the time when you hear about fishing in Alaska, it's either these, real nice flyout lodges or sometimes some tent camps. But I'm going to cover all those under my on all budgets part. So flyout lodges are incredible. I'm sure quite a few have been there. They're beautiful lodges with great food and guides and all that. But then tent camps, which are situated on a river with little to no air option, but hopefully enough salmon and trout on the river you're on that it'll keep you busy. And then I've got a section on multi-day float trips, which is really one of my favorite ways to fish Alaska. And then I've got some do-it-yourself stuff with rental cars and things like that. So here's our big map of Alaska and kind of Anchorage right in the dead center. 99% of the people fly into Anchorage and then fly out to various lodges or smaller towns. And that would be the Bristol Bay area right here. You've got Kodiak and Aliknagik, Dillingham, Naknek, all these famous trout and salmon destinations. And there's probably close to 75 fishing lodges on that map. So even though it's a lot of country, there's a couple of hundred fishing lodges in Alaska. So there's lots to do, lots to see. You can't do it all. The flyout lodges are really nice. They're not cheap. That you get airplanes every day and world-class food and accommodation. It's a difficult business just because of logistics and weather and just getting people in and out every day safely. But they're an unbelievably great concept. And in fact, that last place was the first flyout lodge in Alaska, Kulik Lodge. And it's only about 60 years old, so they haven't been doing it all that long. But you've got a fleet of airplanes, top of the line guides, and very few people are ever disappointed with a flyout lodge trip. Even when the weather's sort of iffy, you can still get out most of the time and or be on water with jet boats that you can fish all you want. And this is just an example of, when you do a flyout trip, half the fun is really taking off and flying around Alaska. And that happens to be a Turbo 206, so it's fairly fast. But when you're in an old de Havilland Beaver, flying low and slow, you get to look at bears and wolves and caribou and all sorts of cool stuff, moose, and then up and down the rivers, following, the river, looking at the spawning salmon and all that. It's just great. I'm a sucker for looking out the window, even on commercial flights, and trying to figure out where I'm at. But just gorgeous scenery on a pretty day. So your average flyout lodge would be, super nice. You're going to be paying in the neighborhood of $8,000 to up to $11,000, $12,000 a week at the real premier lodges. So, you know, if you think about it, it costs a little more than $1,000 a day. That doesn't scare off everybody. And it's just kind of the price of doing business up there. And even though chefs at one lodge don't know what's going on at all the other lodge, it's very competitive, because even guides on the Deschutes and things, you know, they really have to up their game with food, or people won't be coming back. So it's just beyond good. It's like going to the best restaurant in a big city every night. And then there's the fleet of boats. You know, you've got your airplanes, you got boats. You know, when I was working in 1979 in King Salmon, Alaska, at a lodge, a tomato cost about $3 and a cantaloupe was $5. And I think a bottle of Bailey's was about $75. So everything is so expensive by the time you ship it and get it all the way up there. Consequently, that's kind of what controls prices. But it's these rainbows that, you know, most fly fishers like to go after, and you throw in char, grayling, pike, sometimes sheefish, and then 5 species of salmon. And there's not too many places you can do this. It's nice that, you know, we can get to Alaska with just a short flight to Seattle and then 3 hours to Anchorage. So pretty lucky to have it that close. And again, an old beaver flying around. You don't have too many days like this in the summer, even though it's summer. You know, I spent a year in the Forest Service, and it was the wettest summer in Alaska's history. And literally the sun was out about 3 days. Now, that's not normal, but you gotta be ready for almost everything. It's not cold because it's all low elevation type of stuff. But yeah, you have a little wind, you have a little rain, but the nice days are just incredible. In fact, you know, July is pretty darn nice weather up there. June and July are great. Beautiful scenery. Yeah. Now, then after all that flying, you got to go fishing, you know. This is a good example of early season. A little snow flurry came in overnight, and the plane flew in, dropped these guys off who got in a jet boat, and they're fishing the outlet of this lake where all the small little salmon fry are migrating out of all the streams, literally billions of them. And then they have to all funnel down into this river. It's the Lagnac. And consequently, the rainbows and char just get stacked in there, feeding on these small migratory salmon. And then the plane will take off and come back and get you. So tip number 1 tonight is, on a day like this, you're obviously going to be dressed pretty warm. But the thing to bring is a big Coleman, or not Coleman, a big thermos for your hot coffee, tea, or hot chocolate. And I always take one everywhere I go. I don't drink coffee, but I like tea and hot chocolate. And I be out there at 9 in the morning and have a nice coffee or a nice cup of tea or something. And everybody looks at me and goes, wow, that's a pro move. And why they don't supply them at most lodges, I don't know. Some must, but always having your big Stanley thermos around is great. Now, wilderness tent camps, I've been to quite a few. So we've got 4 jet boats there. So it's probably a camp boat plus 3 guide boats. So a capacity for 6 anglers. You fly in, you get dropped off for a week. And this is where people will target, usually a particular species or 2. For instance, you might go later in the season in August and be targeting silvers, or go early in the season with rainbows on mice, and a little later than kings. So these little tent camps are portable. They can move upriver, and if they're in a good spot, you don't have to move at all. But you pay about half the price of a flyout lodge, and you get about half. You know, you get half the everything, except you get a little bit of more time on the water. So that's kind of a nice caveat there. This is more of a permanent tent camp, and these are called weather port structures, and they're technically kind of a tent, but they're really a structure. Plywood floors, a big hoop design, AstroTurf on the inside, a heater, a couple bunks, and they're quite comfortable, really dry and warm. And the poor guides have to live in those little backpacking tents. But But there's inside, not bad. You're not paying a whole bunch and you're comfortable, warm and dry, and there's great fishing. Good father-son opportunities. And then the dining hall, and they're a giant weatherport structure. They have a generator, hot showers. You can charge your phones and all that stuff for using your camera, but again, no glorious log cabins and anything. It's just a very, very practical stuff. And so, if you look at this picture, you get there to this tent camp and you look at those boats and you go, oh my God, I mean, look at those things. They're really beat up. And true, yeah, they are a little bit beat up. But then you look at the motors and they're all nice, new and shiny. And I just go, oh, good. So I would rather have a new motor in an old boat instead of the other way around. And you find that the tent camps are much more informal and casual. Food can be excellent to just world class. But you don't have the ambiance of the bearskin rugs and all this. And sometimes that lodge atmosphere can kind of get to you with different people trying to one-up each other on how big their fish were, how many places they've been. And it seems like the tent camp folks just like to fish and tie flies and are as interested in the status-seeking part of fly fishing. Making some s'mores. So most of the time, you'll, in a tent camp, you'll get up with, it's usually two of the boat, sometimes one if there's an odd number, and you roar around and you go up river, down river, up tributaries, into lagoons with pike and that sort of thing. And once in a while, they'll just idle near a big log jam and you can throw a mouse in there and hop it off a log and twitch it across. It's pretty darn nice. But this is your general lineup. So a nice coho, silver salmon upper left, and then a pike upper right, grayling and rainbows, plus Arctic char. And but it's these rainbows I think most people get if they're pretty serious in the fly fishing. They love the rainbows. It's mouse fishing, it's streamer fishing, at times really good dry fly fishing. Not a lot of nymph fishing. The closest thing to nymph fishing would be the egg patterns and beads. And that's generally mid to late season. But beautiful fish, some of the prettiest in the world. When they get to around 22, 23 inches, and you catch it on a mouse, that is day-making, trip-making stuff. They love a mouse. They just hammer that thing. And if you've done it, you know that they'll hit it and you miss them because it's a big, bulky fly. They don't always get hooked. And then they hit it again, and then they hit it again. Sometimes on the third strike on that cast, you'll finally get the hook in one. Arctic char, they call them Cheeto lips, but they get big, they fight hard. There's a lot of char in some rivers, and after a while, you might go back to fishing the fly instead of a streamer because you'll catch so many char at times. You go back to the mouse, which is a little more selective to rainbows. And of course, pike are in quite a few river systems. Not all of them, not up higher where it's just gravel bar, spawning salmon and trout. Down low where there's a lot of these sloughs and slower water. And man, there's some places they're just thick. In fact, on my last trip, which was in September, I fished this exact same spot. This picture was taken 2 years ago. And the pike were so thick, slashing at our flies, we called it a pike NATO. It was just ridiculous fun. That was from September. Really nice big pike. You fish a 6-inch streamer. Typical flies would be used in Lake Billy Chinook for dollies, big bait fish flies. And grayling, most iconic fish of the north. And they're just great. I wouldn't want a steady diet of grayling fishing, but I always take my 4-weight and some just traditional dry flies. Look for rising fish, which is just about everywhere, and then try to find some nice ones. This one was 18 inches, which is a really nice grayling. And when they get that size, the fins just get more lit up, more colorful, more striped, and they're a super neat fish. I always put my 4-weight in, no matter if we're going pike fishing or salmon fishing, because sometimes we'll take a lunch break on a side channel or on an island. And if I see a rising grayling, I put down my sandwich and go catch it. It's really fun. Here's she-fish, not as common in Bristol Bay in the trout country, but up north, this happens to be the it's the Aniak River. It goes into the Kuskokwim, and that goes out towards Bethel. And so this is actually the southernmost river in North America for she-fish, and the northernmost river in North America for rainbow trout. So you got 5 species of salmon, rainbow, grayling, char, actually a whitefish, she-fish. I mean, we caught 9 species up there. So in September, just really fun. So these are medium to smaller size she-fish. Other rivers have larger fish. They get up to about 15, 25 pounds. But they eat the salmon smolt and fry. They're tricky fish. They're not super easy to catch. They'll refuse your fly and follow it, not eat it. But, you fish for them earlier in the year, meaning late June, July, when it's really, really light out. And those pictures there are taken at 10 p.m. and about midnight on the right. And that guy holding the fish there is Todd Moen. He and I started Catch Magazine, if you're familiar with that. And then I gave him my half, and he does it by himself now. And so he does all these great fly fishing videos. He'd be a good speaker for you guys to get sometime. Anyhow, they have a body and a top fin with that little thing that hangs off that looks a little bit like a tarpon. And they have kind of a tarpon-looking mouth. So up there, of course, people call them the tarpon of the north. But I filed that away because down in Florida, you never hear anyone call tarpon the she-fish of the south. But they're great fish, hard fighting, tricky, really fun if you can find them. So this is fishing at 1 o'clock in the morning, prime time for she-fish. And that is middle of the night, as dark as it's going to get for maybe another half hour, and then the sun will come up again. Oh, more food. Gotta love it. Jeez. They have to outdo the next lodge over. So king crab legs and sockeye fillets, shrimp and prawns. It's all good stuff. So tent camp, steak night. The chef's got his gun, thinks that's going to help him when bears come in, but it looks good. And then float trips. When I first started fishing in Alaska, I was just, working and fishing on my days off. And I just walked around and things like that. But then when I wanted to go back and fish Alaska in the mid 80s, I didn't really have the money to go to a lodge or fish with guides. So my brother and I started doing float trips where you basically fly up to Anchorage, go buy all your food, put it in a cooler. You have sleeping bags and stuff like that, but you find these outfitters that have the rafts and the tents and the propane stove and all the big stuff, and you buy a package, raft, oars, and then all the other accoutrements. So back then, you could do airfare and a week-long 100-mile float trip for $1,000 and just fish your brains out and have fun with your buddies because you're cooking and camping and making margaritas out of tequila and crystal lime, like Squirt or Sprite or whatever it would take. So super fun. It slowly graduated up to, I did a couple outfitted trips, which is really nice because then you just show up and you got your sleeping bag and your gear and you go. But it costs a little bit more. It's something that everybody should think about. If you have good rowing skills and have a GPS, well, you're ready to go. You just need to follow their rules and instructions about where to be when you're getting picked up and be safe. And it's really a great adventure without, going to the middle of the Amazon and get eaten by a crocodile or something. There's bears, but we would time our float trips in the spring when the upper float was great for rainbows and rainbows and char. And as we get down to the lower river, it was the first Chinook were coming up. So there weren't enough salmon in the river yet to really make the bears target the rivers. They were still in the woods doing berries and whatever else they can eat. I love bears, but I don't need a lot of bears in camp. Every once in a while you have a little encounter, but fishermen are really pretty safe around bears. Hunters who have shot a caribou or a moose are very much at risk, but just floating and camping and not doing stupid stuff, like with food and things like that. Very rarely is there a problem with a fisherman. So there's my watch. It's bright and sunny out. It's 10:30 p.m. and it's the warmest part of the day because the sun's been up forever and things heating up. So here we are camping on a float trip, shorts and t-shirts, no mosquitoes. Sometimes it's really, really nice. Now, if it was a little cloudy and a little drizzly, that really brings out the mosquitoes, and you have to expect that. But there's plenty of decent days in the summertime to really just act normal, and you'll generally always have a river to yourself. There's not much traffic up there. One year I flew, I sent FedEx 2 pontoon boats to the little village of Antioch, where I have a friend who lives there, and they actually showed up, and we had flown in and they were there and still in the box, and we arranged to get shuttled way upriver about 80 miles and then dropped off, and we had about 6 days to float out. And what a great trip. Didn't see any people, didn't see any bears, but there's tracks along the rivers everywhere, but they're mostly coming out at night because in this area bears are hunted. It's not in a national park, so the bears hear a motor or hear people and they skedaddle up into the hills. So the 2 pontoon boats was great. Oh yeah, there you go. There's a bear at night. I always take my trail cam with me and set it up somewhere near a trail. And yeah, that's what happens at night. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be out there. Well, and speaking of that, so here's a small Jack Chinook. It's enough to, it's a little bit too much for 2 people, but you'd be surprised how much you can eat. And that's an ideal fish to keep to eat. You on these trips, you don't have the luxury of bringing a ton of food. You're going to have to eat some fish, and you don't have any ice, so you keep a little mesh bag in the river with your drinks and things. But just for instance, if you were handling that fish to prepare it for dinner, you'd make sure you'd really wash your hands well, throw the head and carcass and guts way out in the current, let it drift away. If you went from handling a fish to maybe over to your pontoon boat and touched the pontoon or touched some gear, and a bear came into camp that night, it would smell that spot, it would sniff it, and it would probably bite it, and it could pop your pontoon. So just being extra careful, common sense stuff. And you have salmon every way you want. I mean, grilled, baked, with bacon, we figured we made salmon something except salmon margaritas. And then, finding a nice little gravel bar, fishing all day. If you want time on the water and a little bit of adventure, a float trip's the way to go. Now there's another perfect eating Jack Chinook. They're probably not going to contribute to the spawn. And if you catch one on our float trips, you don't have to do dishes. So it's a prize catch. And like, floating the Deschutes or any other river or up at East Lake or wherever, hanging around the camp and just cooking up good food and telling stories. That's one of the best parts of fly fishing. Now this is an outfitter, obviously, those matching tents and everything. And here's the pork tenderloin night. And then there was even a lobster tail night. And we ate so much on this trip, we called it float and bloat. It was just too much food. This guy's disgusted. He goes, "Are you kidding me? Rib night?" Jeez, trying to fatten everybody up. And then one of the key elements of some of those float trips is this screened in little kind of gazebo tent thing. because it becomes, a changing room. It becomes the bar, it becomes the kitchen, hang out if the bugs are out. And on this trip, I was with a friend of mine who was also a guide in Alaska, like myself. So when we go on a guided trip, we feel almost embarrassed for the guide. Like, you don't have to treat us very nice. We used to do this. Just bark out your orders and we'll do it. But it's really fun to give them some time off the oars, let them fish or fish in camp, because, a lot of people think it's sort of taboo if the guide fishes, but sure is a lot more fun when the guide with you and he's having a great time. There he is, a little rainbow right in camp. Beautiful, beautiful fish. So on a float trip, you'd start in basically kind of a headwater situation, an upstream lake or a lake you land in and move your stuff into the river. And actually the first day can be a little slow because it's the least productive probably part of the watershed. It's super cold. There's not that many bugs. There's not as many spawning salmon up here for the creation of eggs and the fry and the smolt. So the first day is probably going to be grayling, a few char, but gorgeous scenery because you're up higher in the watershed where there's going to be mountains, just gorgeous. But then about day 2, you'll start hitting a few tributaries that come in that change the water temperature a little bit. It's not just going to be glacial or snow melt, but the tundra itself, as it leaches into these rivers, is warm and or warmer, and then you get the rainbows and all that action starts. And the good thing about camping is you can build a giant fire, pretend that it scares the bears away. So now we're going to kind of look at the seasons. This is a little Sockeye Fry. It's about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches in June and July. Easy to imitate with a fly. It's just a shiny thing with a little dark back and either marabou or a little flashy tail, and then but a very prominent eye. There are rivers that get guided heavily in Alaska, like the Brooks River and the Copper River and Gibraltar and a few others. And there, it's technical fry pattern fishing. It's the Henry's Fork. You've got to match the hatch, the exact size, coloration, prominent eye, and you'll know when someone has the hot fry pattern. And it can be as simple as literally, if you're not using a loop knot, then you're probably out of the game. Using a loop knot, having the right fly, and it's really great action. This is the most food in the river this time of year. There's going to be a few aquatic insects, and there's some sculpin, but it's not going to get good with food until late July and August. There's a little just synthetic fry pattern that works. Wait, and look at that. No loop knot. Not good. Now, these are baby Chinook. And so what happened was we're floating and my buddy catches a big rainbow and the guy nets it, and then boop, up comes a bunch of these baby Chinook out of the trout's mouth and makes perfect shot to see that your baby Chinook flies need to be just a little bit bigger than your baby sockeye flies. So then you have chum, silvers, and all these others, but the sockeye outpopulate all those others by 10 to 1. But if it's a river that's got a lot of kings, then you want some of these bigger, fatter fry patterns. Now, when I went up there in I think it was 78 or 79, I can't remember, to guide my first year, I didn't really know what the fry pattern thing was all about. I'd never fished it on the Kenai. And then I was on this stream by myself, and I saw these fish kind of rolling, not rising, but I thought, God, maybe they're on emergence or something, being a trout fisherman. But then I finally hooked the fish, and when it jumped, I saw a little silver thing fly out of his mouth, a little baby salmon. I went, oh, they're chasing those baby salmon. But we didn't have any fry patterns, but we had some plastic tubing and a golden retriever. So we put golden retriever hair on the back and painted an eyeball on it and had a fry pattern. We also made one out of a nail, just a short little piece of a nail golden retriever tail eyeball, and that was good enough. Hard to cast, but the fish ate it until we could finally get some materials and tie an actual fry pattern. Do you remember back in the day, it was fairly popular, the Jansen minnow? It was one of the first sort of epoxy, lifelike minnows. It was very good also. But everything eats them, and that's a lake trout on the right. You'll have lake trout that position themselves in the outlets and inlets of lakes, getting these thousands and millions of fry that are swimming by. And that was a, same thing, swinging them across the riffles. And everything eats them. The grayling, the char, the rainbows, and lake trout. So here's a really good spot. If you're with a guide, he's going to take you here. If you're doing it yourself, always be aware of small creeks coming in, because thousands of sockeye have gone up there and spawned, and then millions of sockeye fry are going to come out. So an outlet to a big river. The big river is the Nushagak, and the fish in this area will just stack up on that first little dump of where the tributary comes in. You also see a lot of diving terns and gulls eating from the top, and the fish are coming up from the bottom. It's more like a saltwater feeding frenzy, but it's really fun. It's the first cast every time. There's the minnow in action. So here's a sort of a dark day, thanks to the clouds, probably 10:30 at night. And this is when it can be really good if you're not completely fished out by then. But this is when it can really get hot, because those little baby salmon travel the most during the darkest part of the day because it's the safest. And then the fish really get pretty active when they're active. So if you want to fish until your arm falls off, those tent camps and those float trips are really, really good. Now, mousing turns out to be just about everybody's favorite, because it's the big visual surface takes, and it's just really an exciting way to fish. And it is sort of selective to rainbows, but it's part of their diet. I got to fish in Kamchatka once, and, I asked the guide about, I've seen rodents, whether they're voles or moles or shrews or mice, whatever they are, lemmings. I've seen them in the river. I see them swimming across and stuff. I've seen them get eaten. I said, but how much of a trout's diet up here do you think a small rodent is? And he says, well, we every once in a while hook a fish really bad and it bleeds so much and it won't revive, and we'll eat it. I said, yeah, and then what's in the stomach? And he goes, one time, 17 mice in one trout. So that's a 26-inch rainbow, but holy cow, that is definitely part of their diet. And these small little tributaries are fun to walk up. You can either, these are also places where you can fish a fry pattern in the early season, but by, third week of June, all through July, you can fish these small tributaries with a mouse. You won't often catch, a big trophy rainbow, which is, 24 plus, but you'll catch a lot of 16 to 20 inchers and have tons of action, no boot prints anywhere, just bear tracks. Really, really fun fishing. That's the mouse pattern called the Mr. Hanky. And was invented by Jeff Hickman. It's a guide on the Deschutes. And also the Moorish mouse, Ken Moorish's fly pattern from Ashland. And there's one well chewed. And this would be sort of typical habitat for trout and a good place to fish the mouse, where there's lots of root wads and logs and overhanging trees. The trout just get stacked in there, and this is where they just go nuts on mice. And this last trip I went on in September, in fact, it was the last week of the season, I still fished a mouse, and most people think it's mostly a early season thing before the eggs start, but once the eggs and the flush fishing starts, they get off the mouse. But I don't think that's true at all. And in fact, if you can catch them on the last week of September, well, just use a mouse whenever you want. Here's a little rule of photography. That's my friend Matt Labounty. He was a defensive end for the Seahawks, Packers, and the 49ers. He's a giant. and he makes fish look small. That's actually a really nice rainbow, but with Matt in the picture, it looks like a 14-incher. He went to, he was a duck, and now he's a teacher in Eugene. Great guy. Dry flies. It's quite common to hit a nice hatch in the Bristol Bay area and beyond, especially up in grayling country, up north towards Fairbanks. But in the big rainbow waters, there'll be stoneflies and there'll be mayflies. There's tons of caddis and occasional small, unless I said already, this lime green stonefly. But it's not that uncommon to get out in a big hatch, and I've always got my dry flies on me, but a lot of other people don't even bring them and don't have any 4X or 5X, and the guides don't either. They got 10-pound maxima, 15-pound maxima, and 20-pound maxima. And so sometimes I've just outfitted the guests with my flies I never use around here anymore, humpies and wolves and parachute Adams, and it can be just incredible fun fishing. Now in this shot, that rainbow was caught on that riffle behind him, and what had happened was thousands of sockeyes have moved up this river, and this is in the Wood Tick Chick State Park, largest state park in the United States. It's just covered in sockeye, but they're not spawning yet. I mean, they don't just get there and spawn. They got to mess around with each other and fight and dig and do all that stuff. But there's thousands of them in there, and they've pulled up hundreds and hundreds of rainbows on their journey up, and the rainbows are all in the mix with them. But there's no eggs, so they're waiting, and there's really not much food going on. So if you throw on a giant stimulator, a big royal wolf, a Madam X, and just something insecty kind of looking, bouncing along that riffle, these big rainbows come up and eat it because they don't really maybe know what it is, but there's no eggs, so you got to eat something. I've just had fantastic dry fly fishing when all the other guys were geared up with beads and ready to bead them. And now you can catch rainbows on a bead before the eggs, but it's just not nearly as effective. But so I fall back onto dry fly fishing quite often. You have slick water, like parts of the Deschutes up near Sunriver, and similar to the Henry's Fork, and you'll just see noses coming up, just like any real trout. And it's longer leaders, 12-foot leader and 4X. Probably don't need 5X too much unless you're using a really small fly for grayling or something, but regular old dry fly fishing. On the upper right, that's where, and the bottom also, it's this giant lake, and then it slowly starts to move and turn into an actual river. And that transition zone of lake to the river, where it just starts to move, there are prolific hatches in there, green drakes and other mayflies. The ones I've seen look like a March brown. I don't know if they are because it's not March, but it might be March in Alaska by climate. But you just walk these big gravel flats looking for risers. It's mostly a downstream presentation, and it's just incredible. A lot of people are up there to throw big streamers, which I'll do, and I enjoy it. But if there's rising fish around, I'll stop for that all the time. Other people might take off and go fish streamers and do their thing, but I'll take a dry fly any day. It's kind of out of focus, but that's a lime green stonefly. They're very common. In fact, on one river I worked on, the Copper River, which is fly fishing only, flows into Lake Iliamna. There were so many of these lime green stoneflies that the guests at our lodge, we only took 6. They all decided to have a dry fly tournament one day, and because the fishing was just red hot. And I think the guy that won caught about 60 fish on tries, which that's pretty darn good because quite a few of them were fairly large. There's that lime green humpy. Oh yeah. And of course, dry fly fishing is synonymous with fishing for grayling. Nice big grayling there. You know what? We don't use a lot of these old-fashioned flies anymore, humpies and wolves, and we don't have a lot of cutthroat. And boy, it's kind of nice to break them out. It's very nostalgic. And there's a beautiful, I call it a brown drake spinner, but it could be, you know, I don't know exactly, but it was big and the fish were all over it. There was a moose head and antlers underwater on one of our float trips. We saw it, we got out, it was super heavy, weighed about 150 pounds. We finally drug it out onto the bank and it was absolutely covered in case caddis. And I've been noticing the last couple of days that the side of our raft was just covered with caddis. And so when we set up camp that night and had dinner, I went out with just an elk hair caddis, and geez, it was great. Just everywhere I cast, it was amazing. So yeah, definitely think about our normal insects that we have in Central Oregon, and they pay off up there. There's that big royal wolf. Anyway, you get down to the middle of the season, late June and July, you've got the kings coming in where you can take a 9-weight, and I usually have found just a medium fast sinking tip is generally best. A lot of the rivers we fish aren't super big. If they're big, you do go to fast sinking. If they're not, I've even used intermediate lines, and you can get a decent swing on these kings. They're fairly easy to catch, especially out in the real wilderness where they've never been fished for, and they come in and you got to get kind of a slow swing right through their zone. And I've gone to several places where it was just king fishing only. And after about 5 days, I was like, oh God, is there anything else? Because, you know, they're 18 to 25 pound average, and man, they just wear you out. Now this one is a nice one. It's probably 11 or 12 pounds. You can get it in and get it off and it won't kill you. But, you know, you always want to catch a big one. And then after you do, you kind of hope you catch a couple more smaller ones. But this is on the Sandy River. It's not a well-known river because there's only one lodge and they're always booked up and nobody changes their spots. They keep them year after year. So they don't have a big fancy website or they do much advertising, but it flows right into the ocean with full current. And it's, well, I'll show you a few pictures here in a second. It's around Nelson Lagoon out on the Aleutian Peninsula. So the Alaska Peninsula, right before the Aleutians start. And then there's chums. Chum salmon are tough fish. As a lot of you know that have fished in the Northwest, you know, a chum probably breaks more fly rods than kings because they have a little secret fifth gear, and very powerful fish. And of course, sockeye. You know, I don't fish for sockeye very much, but I sure like to eat them. And the technique for sockeye is kind of what they call flossing. And you just get your equipment just kind of drifting down, and they're constantly opening their mouth when they breathe like this. And you basically, your gear gets caught in there and slides out until your fly sticks them. And that's flossing. And, you know, if you want to just catch them to kill, to eat, I don't know if it really matters how you do it, but it's that little bonefish fly right there. I've actually caught quite a few sockeye on it, and they actually will follow it and eat it like they're eating it, not just being flossed. But that's the bright red meat, and man, oh man, is it good. And then we've got summer trout flies, more streamers. Of course, I'm always gonna have some dry flies. You got a few egg patterns. You don't need them quite yet until most of the sockeye are spawning, but the egg suck and leach and different sculpin patterns are very effective. And on a float trip, sometimes you just take the littlest amount of equipment. So this box has beads and eggs, some streamers. See if here's my cursor. So I've got some dry flies and nymphs up here. I hardly ever used nymphs. This was my little fry patterns here. And yeah, more dries. So I try to put everything in one box. Then I probably have another box of streamers and mice. And I always take a yellow one because if you get into some nice big char, they just love yellow. There's some sort of articulated egg-sucking leech. They just eat this stuff. This is one of the nicest rainbows I've ever caught. It's not quite the biggest, but just by condition factor, built more like a real fresh steelhead. It was a big fish. What was neat is in the background is the airplane. We got dropped off, made my first cast, and hooked this fish on a big streamer. And then the guide held it. That's a nice way to start the trip. Big, huge rainbow like that. That's more of an average Bristol Bay rainbow, around 21 inches. And this is real common. There'll be bears doing their thing, you doing yours, and it's just basically common sense. You know, if there's a couple coming down, you know, you might wade across the river in some cases and get out of their way, or move back and let them pass and then go back out. A lot of these rivers in Bristol Bay are in Katmai National Park or other places where hunting is not allowed. And so since these bears are, for generation after generation, have never seen any aggression by fishermen, they really don't mess with them too much. They really want salmon, and that's all. And so again, just kind of common sense, keep out of their way. You get the look if you've gotten too close, especially sow with cubs. And you know, there's a few stories of a bluff charge now and then or something like that, but they're really keyed in on salmon. This was a fun summer trip. Look at that short sleeve shirts, beautiful weather. And this was a, you know, deal. We got flown in, dropped off, pumped up these little Watermaster rafts, and then floated out to a big lake. And man, oh man, just great fishing. You can see in the foreground those little red spots, and those are all sockeye. So we generally fish behind sockeye or in just traditional trout water. Don't really want to catch the sockeye when they're red, and you do occasionally, and it's just sort of a tug of war to get them off. But the rainbows are mingling with them or behind and waiting for eggs. But sometimes there's someone fishing in the middle of the river that you need to row through, and you just have to pull over and wait a while until they catch one and go to the bank to eat it. Then late summer, early fall will be silvers, and they don't come up in every river, but they're just a great fish. And again, I wouldn't want a steady diet of only silvers. I've got to have some rainbows, some graylings, some char to mix it up with. But you know, the silver was kind of made for fly fishing because they're very aggressive to the fly. They hit, they jump, and we all know they're just a good fish. Coho are fun, especially when they're bright chromers right out of the ocean. And the wog, especially closer to tidewater where you can get that waking across the current, little pops. You'll see a giant wake coming up and hitting them. We got into some good wog fishing on the Antioch River this September with some older, not chrome bright silvers, but shiny, just not chrome. And so much fun when you see a wake from 5 feet away coming, and then it's good fun. And so in that time of the year, I still got a couple mice. I still got a couple fry patterns because they're a bit bigger now. This is more late in the season. They've grown up a little bit. The regular selection of some bigger streamers. These are flesh flies because as the salmon die and they drift, they get stuck on a root wad or something, and they're basically pretty rotten. But the rainbows, and you can watch them, they'll just come up and just grab a hunk of meat and shake it off the salmon and eat salmon flesh. And then as that's happening and fish are decomposing, there is flesh just in the drift. So flesh flies and then silver flies. And again, there's my good old dry flies and ready to go, ready for action. And then the guide has a fancy bead box, and beading is just, you know, nymphing basically and imitating eggs. So in here you would have some giant king salmon eggs, some small sockeye or pink salmon eggs, silvers here. And you guys know the drill. I mean, you run it up your leader and then you have a hook about 1.5 inches back and they eat the egg and pow, you got them. It's not exactly purist fly fishing, but it's very effective. A little ptarmigan up there and bear tracks everywhere. And here's a friend of mine, sort of high stick nymphing, but probably with an egg pattern below those sockeye. And the rainbows get fairly brazen because they're into eggs and they're into salmon of all stages. So I don't think they like to occupy these shallow riffles where the salmon spawn. They love being back in the root wads, the channels, and deeper water, but they throw caution to the wind and follow the salmon because they're fairly vulnerable to eagles. Bears don't really mess with trout, but I'm sure they see them stomping around them all the time. Probably freaks them out. But because they're in that shallow water, you can sight fish them. And, you know, I don't care what kind of fish it is, when you can see them and catch them, it's pretty fun. Now, some rental car stuff, say you're up there for business or just to want to fish bum around for a while, you can get a rental car. Now, this is a few years ago when you could get these Subaru wagons for $39 a day. Now, those days are long gone, but you can get a minivan with a couple friends for not too much. And you can camp, you can get little cabins, you can get Airbnb. There's quite a few ways to do it yourself. And there's quite a bit of road accessible fishing out of Anchorage. It's not always so remote, you'll be the only one there. In fact, some rivers, when the Sockeye or the Silvers are running, are wall-to-wall people. And you've heard or seen the pictures of combat fishing, which is just crazy. But that's usually near parking lots or a campground. And the Russian River is the most famous, probably, that flows into the Kenai. Well, there'll be 400 people in 300 yards. You know, it's just ridiculous. But I just hike upstream. Nobody does. And I have a mile of river to myself. And generally, I'm looking for rainbows. So that's the water I want to fish anyway. But there's a lot of do-it-yourself fishing or day guides and things like that. There's day flyouts. You can get flown out for a day and see the wilderness. This happens to be Willow Creek. It's on the way to Denali on the highway to Fairbanks. And there's nobody around because it's in the fall, which would mean late August. And the silvers are all done. People are gone. All those people wearing hip boots and with a big gun and all that stuff. So I would traditionally do a work trip because I was a sales rep in the 80s, 90s to 2006. And so I'd make my sales calls so that I would time it with the fishing, of course. And I'd have to drive up to Fairbanks and hit different little lodges and stuff on the way. And I'd always fish Willow Creek and have these beautiful rainbows, sometimes not as big as the real big fish in Bristol Bay, but rental car, cabin or tent, and rivers to yourself, catching fish like that, that's pretty fun. And if you study it a bit, you'll find there's a Goose Creek, there's a Montana Creek, besides the Willow in the same drive. They all have rainbows, and they're all beautiful. Yeah, not a person in sight. This is on the Kenai River, and the Kenai Peninsula is actually extremely beautiful. It just gets kind of a bad rap because the Kenai River itself is fairly crowded, but you know, it's road accessible from Anchorage, so you're going to have that. It's just a fact of life. There's a lot of float planes in Alaska, but the ones that don't own a plane, you know, they have to get there by car. And you'll see crowds of people at peak times, but there's ways to float rivers with a guide or go up some tributaries or even go to some lakes on the Kenai and find great fishing. Great big rainbow in the Kenai. And here's a friend of mine. He had a fly shop in Alaska for a while, and there's a rainbow on the left and a silver salmon on the right, a couple hours apart, and the rainbow's bigger than the silver. So, I mean, that's pretty fun when your trout are bigger than salmon. There's a char and a rainbow, and again, it's kind of bead fishing in the fall, and you know, it's not a fly, but I'm gonna just have to tell you, if you're paying big bucks for a guide, want to maximize your time, you'll probably fish a bead. It's just effective, but don't spill the bead box. That would get you killed. Let's just take a quick jaunt to Kodiak. It was also on my tour of sporting goods stores and fly shops to visit. And Kodiak is just a great place. The weather is horrible, but there's a couple nice lodges out there, and there's some day trips. You can charter in and float the Kulik, or not the Kulik, but the Carlock River. And geez, you can go crabbing for king crab, catch Chinook in the salt. There's just a lot of stuff going on Kodiak. So there you have Kodiak and the main town itself, and all those little arms that you see coming in are river systems. So it's loaded with fresh water because it rains constantly. You'll see signs like this where you can't walk because of bears, and you've all heard about Kodiak bears. It's the Alaska brown bear, and some of them just really, really big. And you know, I fished Kodiak several times and never had an issue because where I've been, they've been well fed, like this one, just a big, huge, fat bear. He's thinking, oh, I'd have to run to catch him, and I'd rather just eat salmon. And the ones that I worry about actually are ribby bears, you know, skinny, or they might have a lot of scarring on their face where they've lost fights for a prime fishing spot, and young bears that don't have a good fishing spot yet. So there's definitely, you know, again, common sense situations to look for and avoid, but the big giant ones like that, they're kind of lazy. Well, I did want to sneak up on this big sow, and then when she gave me that look, I knew, and I was using a telephoto lens. I'm not that close, really. I'm probably, well, I'm 75 feet away, but she was giving me the look, and you know, that's close enough. So these are day trips. You fly in a little float plane, pump up a raft, and go to the outlet of the lake and float it just about to saltwater. And it's a day float. This is the Carlock River, which is one of the best rivers in the world. It has some rainbows. It's got tons of steelhead, tons of silvers, kings. It's just loaded with fish. And you just enjoy it. It's the greenest place I've ever been. People say it's as green as Ireland. And I go, oh, I've never been to Ireland, but it's sure green. And the times that I've gone up here have been during king season. And they don't get a run of real big kings like other rivers, particularly the Kenai. These are 12 to 18 pounds. 20 is the magic number. But there's pretty good numbers of them. And it's just a great fly fishing river. If you just looked at the river itself, it looks a lot like the Madison. It's a giant, really long riffle, broken up with a few pools and some boulders. So every good spot is going to be loaded with salmon. And yeah, it's just a great time. Yeah. And then take a day off and go halibut fishing or crabbing. It's pretty phenomenal. Amazing place. If the weather wasn't so bad, it'd be a great place to live. And now we're going to go down to Nelson Lagoon. You can see it there in the lower left in Cold Bay. And this is getting out more towards the Aleutians and you know, deadliest catch type places. But these are pretty deadly in my opinion. And they are not touristy. These are for pretty much hardcore fishing and commercial fishing, of course. Commercial fishing, but as far as sport fishing goes, it's not like going to Belize. You know, this is sideways winds, rough and tumble characters, but there are a couple camps like this. Again, the weatherport structures, electric bear fence, situated on the banks of the Hoodoo River. And man, it's just gorgeous. Wildflowers, great size of a river, and it gets a really nice king run. And they're medium size. So you might catch a 25 pounder. The magic number's 30, but after you've caught a 26 or 7 pounder, you kind of don't want a 30 pounder. But again, a lot of action where your arm just gets worn out. And we would have a good hole that had new fish coming into it. There was 3 of us, and we would just sort of take turns. And then when the guy caught one, he'd fight it downriver. Then the next guy would go in, and we just did laps like that all day long and day after day. And wow, it is, your arm is just killing you. Look at how bright and shiny these fish are. They're just gorgeous. Powerful. These guys are all huge guys. I mean, giant guys. I don't know why I don't fish with small people to make fish look bigger, but anyhow, there was a triple hookup. And flies don't matter a whole bunch. I would say the most important thing is probably sink rate, because you might fish some water that's only 3.5 or 4 feet deep, and you would not want to use that big cone head on top, but a more of a light fly with a lot of rabbit or something on it, so it doesn't sink too fast. And then a big, fast sinking fly for any deep pools of 6 or 8 feet. But color, yeah, maybe you feel like you got hot for a while on chartreuse and then purple. I don't know. But I think if it's in the right spot, it's going to get hit. In that particular tent camp, they run you upriver with 2 jet boats. And I think they take 6 people. And it's not super expensive, but king crab dinners and salmon dinners were world class. Now here's Sandy River Lodge. I mentioned them a little earlier. It looks more like a fortress, but it's in an area that has such horrible weather and such strong winds. It's built basically just to last. It's not all that great to look at, but it serves a purpose. And just in the background is the Sandy River. And it's absolutely gorgeous. And so the Hoodoo and the Sandy are the best known rivers in this area. And it's, again, on the end of the Alaska Peninsula. These camps are run and owned by a native corporation. And so it's not easy. I mean, there's one lodge. I don't think you could build another lodge there because they own all the land and they like it the way it is. So, but gorgeous mountains in the background, long, gravelly kind of riffle pool river, no rapids, and it's loaded with steelhead and it's loaded with Chinook. And that's like a little bit bigger than average, pretty nice king. They bite on sunny days, they bite on cloudy days. And they're all within a mile or so of the ocean. Sometimes we fished 100 yards from the surf. So they're coming in absolutely fresh. There's a young bear, still afraid of people, a medium-aged bear, but there's a dead moose right there, so he's eating the moose. Happy. Lots of eagles. Okay, we're going to finish off in the last part, and that's the Southeast Alaska, which is Juneau, Sitka, Ketchikan, Wrangell, Petersburg, all that down there, which is just a lifetime of fishing. And I used to get some friends together. We'd charter a boat with a captain, and we'd go from river to river to river. No airplane access, almost impossible for a day tripper boat to get there. You have to live aboard to fish these spots or out in the boonies. And we fished steelhead primarily in March and April. And, there's 1,000 steelhead streams in Alaska, and most people couldn't name one, so it's not a real, big, important part of sport fishing in Alaska. It's mostly logistics. They're just hard to get to, but there are ways. There's always ways. But now we've left the tundra country and the windswept Alaska Peninsula for big old growth forests, beautiful streams, and really, I mean, you never see a indicator in an eddy or a footprint or a lost tippet bag or anything. It's just absolute wilderness. The same rivers that have steelhead in the spring have silvers in the fall. Some have Chinook, some have chums, and then there's a lot of sea run cutthroats and some sea run Dolly Varden. This is a nice big, real chrome Chinook that hit a hot pink fly in salt water, but near the mouth of a river. And I'd seen some roll, and I threw bait fish patterns since I was in the saltwater, like little herring streamers and stuff, and didn't get a single strike. And then I put on that hot pink, and then they, I think, ate it more out of aggression than anything else. But years ago, this was probably, 25 years ago or more. That's my boat. I had the Zodiac that I shipped up there, and my buddies that lived in Juneau, and we would do a trip every year, and sometimes two, one for steelhead, one for silvers. And I kept my boat up there for, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years, and then sold it. But that boat in the background is a commercial crab boat that used to fish out in the Bering Sea, but Alaska offered their skippers $1 million to turn in their permit and basically have less pressure for the crabs. And so this skipper he took the $1 million and he just converted his boat to more sea kayaking, whale watching, fishing, and just adventure stuff. And we fished with him several years, but you know, if he can fish the Bering Sea for crab, he can fish the tricky inlets and channels and stuff in Southeast Alaska safely. And because of his experience, we could actually go up what they call the outer coast, the outside of the islands, where it's just Pacific Ocean, raw, rough, and nasty, but he can navigate all that, get into little places to anchor, and then you're fishing rivers that, I don't know. I wouldn't say they've never been fished, but you've got to be crazy to try it any other way. And that was the boat. And he had a big davit, so we could pick up a regular jet boat and then pick up my boat and drop them in, and we could be anchored and in the boats and gone in 15 minutes. And then the silvers and the salt, full sinking lines, cast as far as you can, strip it as fast as you can. And man, they are on the bite, and it's really fun. And plus the whole area of Southeast has got a lot of native heritage and water resource, whether it's big giant prawns, crabs, Dungeness and king crab, all the salmon, sea run dollies, sea run cutthroats. It's a pretty place with great fishing, a lot of like native culture. So here's when the shrimp boat comes in. And those are the small ones. They have the big, huge spot prawns that are about 7 inches long. And we saw a boat coming by real slow. And we had a little bit of beer. I mean, maybe a 6-pack of hams. And we drove out there to the boat, and I just sort of acted stupid and said, hey, I got a 6-pack of beer, but I really would like some shrimp or prawns. And the guy goes, oh, throw me your cooler. So we emptied it out and pitched it up on the deck. And he got a big grain shovel out and just started shoveling in a mixture of ice and those giant spot prawns, probably $200 or $300 worth of prawns for a 6-pack of hams. But supply and demand, it's the way we work. King crab, we legally caught king crab because they are very regulated. And that crab boat that we were on had a giant plexiglass aquarium-like thing with salt water in it, so we'd keep the crabs live, and then when it was time to eat them, boom, fresh. And we all love king crab, but if you've ever had one fresh out of the water, it's even better than the best king crab you've ever had. Well, there you go. I am going to give you your lives back. I put my email on there. If you have a question about anything I covered that comes to you later, just fire it off. You know, I don't guide or anything like that. I'd just be more than happy to share some information with you and go from there. But anyhow, I'm going to hit stop share. Let Rini have the control of this meeting. Are you live, Rini?
Right here.
Okay.
I haven't the hosting yet. Yeah, I didn't fall asleep at once, Brian. It was very. No, it was great. Great presentation. Anybody have any questions?
I've got one. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think about the Alagnac in mid-June for trout?
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely fantastic.
Okay, thinking about that.
Yeah, you know, there's that one big lodge down there. I forget the name of it right now, but their rates are actually pretty reasonable, and they don't fly out too much as far as I know, but there's so much good fishing on the Alagnac. It's high on my list.
I was thinking that Anglers Alibi, which is it's kind of a tent camp, but permanent tents.
Yeah, you can't go wrong.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So somebody asked, what is the earliest time in the year you would suggest heading to Alaska for a fishing trip?
Well, I've learned the hard way by going a little too early because their rivers have ice out and runoff, just like other rivers. So I've sort of set my favorite for reliable water conditions and the most fish is the second or third week of July. And if I'm strictly going to some smaller streams to do mostly mouse fishing for rainbows, I'll go the third week of June. But on some of the bigger rivers that have quite a few tributaries that could be pushing a lot of water, I'll wait till after the 4th of July on some of those streams.
And what's the latest you would go?
Third week of September is pretty much, it's all over. But it can be great. In fact, about 4 years ago or 5 years ago, the Fly Shop in Redding needed some photos of a lodge they were representing and didn't have anyone to go. And they asked me if I would go. I said, well, sure. And it was, again, the last week of the season, third week of September. And it was gorgeous blue sky, beautiful weather every day. And the fall colors were amazing and the fishing was incredible. So, you know, it's sort of a roll of the dice for whether you fish here, there, or in the Bahamas, you know. So it's just so much fun when you get a lucky break every once in a while and just have incredibly good fishing. And I wanted to say hi to Leanne Ross. Are you still awake?
I am still here. Yes. Hello. We took a couple skadden boats up there this year and floated the Kenai.
Oh,
we didn't really know what we were doing, but we got some fish. You know, it was fun.
Well, yeah, it's the adventure of it all. Doing it yourself is really cool.
Yeah. So we'll try again. We'll get better at it over time.
Oh yeah. Well, that first trip's just a learning experience mostly anyway. Logistics and whens and wheres and hows and boat ramps and all that stuff.
If you were to take a float to a pontoon boat up there to float, what river would you pick?
Well, there's quite a few. The Kodiak is a good one.
Day tripping.
Oh, and the day trip. Well, that's a little harder.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the Kenai is probably one of your better bets.
Yeah.
Cool. They don't have road systems like we do and boat ramps every 10 miles, you know.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I've got a question. It's Ken Munson here. Hey, I really appreciate the presentation. It was lively and it was good. Yeah. I hope I remember 10% of it. You know, on your coverage of Southeast Alaska, that looked like a pretty interesting. I mean, it all looked interesting, but I think with the variety of fishing and crabbing, to experience that, is that typically a day trip? Like you fly into Ketchikan or fly into Juneau and then just do day trips for those things, or do you like go on a guided run for a week?
Well, you can do both, and every town is sort of set up for the day trips. Sitka is a great port to use, and then Wrangell is too. Even Juneau, you just go out of town and you're in the middle of nowhere. So it's all good. Petersburg and Ketchikan, all those. So there's guides that just do the day trips. They primarily are regular terminal tackle fishermen that want to troll for salmon and then bottom fish for halibut. But I think if you go online, you'll probably find, you know, Juneau has a fly shop. Sitka used to have a fly shop. I bet there are people who don't necessarily specialize in it, but accommodate fly anglers. And you might as well maybe do a little of both anyway, because if you want to bring home some halibut or something like that, you know, it's not going to be fly fishing, but you'll probably find someone who's got a little stash of spots for sea run cutthroats and even steelhead and things like that. So it's like going to, you know, Wyoming. If you haven't been there before, you're going to go over and over on the internet and look at different things and read posts and things, and you'll probably luck into a couple people that meet your needs.
Mhm. Great.
Yeah,
Well, thank you.
you're welcome.
Really well done.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right. Well, thanks, Brian. Definitely going to invite you back next year.
Thank you very much, Rini.
Now that we're doing all these Zoom meetings, it'll probably be early in the year if we get to go back to real meetings. 'Cause I don't see paying you to drive up here unless you're going to be fishing up here anyway.
Well, I probably would fish.
Let's see. I think that's it then. If anybody has any questions, I think the newsletters went out a few days ago, so you should have gotten the newsletters. We have our eyes on possibly a get together in December. Might be a potluck, might be appetizers only. I have a place if we can't get Sunriver Brewing. So if you're interested in that, let me know, and we'll try to figure out a good day and a time for everyone. So if nothing else, and in January we have Brian Smith from the Polar Coachman Fly Fishing Club in British Columbia. So, and you have to press your space button if you want to unmute yourself to talk real quick. Otherwise, I'm going to guess that we're all done here. Okay, Brian, it was good to see you again, and all you other people too.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Yep.
See you
Bye-bye.
later.
Thanks, Brian.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.
We've recorded this, so it will be on our page at some point. Don't know when, because Phil's working, but when he comes back in December, he'll edit it and put it up. So, all right, thank you.
Yep,
Bye,
good night.
Brian.
Right. Good
See you
night.
later.